Hey everybody. So before I moved to Poland, I didn't know much at all about Polish art. I didn't know any books, any musicians, or just artists in general. Maybe Polanski and Chopin, but that was about it if I'm being honest. But now, having lived here for almost 6 years, that's obviously changed completely. And it's actually cool to look back now on all of the different Polish content that I have consumed in art in general over the years and think about how it's changed my perception of the country. So today, I thought I would do exactly that. Run through chronologically all of the pieces of Polish content and art in general that I've consumed and think about how that shaped the way that I see this country. One important thing that I want to mention just before we start is that this isn't going to be strictly about Polish art in the sense of art produced, give me a moment, art produced in Poland by Polish people, but I also want to cover art produced internationally, globally about Poland too, because it all helped to inform my viewpoints on Poland from the very early days up until now. So with that said, let's get into it. Dawaj. Okay, so let's go back to the very start of my journey in Poland, which was to the summer of 2018 when I was planning my very first trip here, which was going to be a solo trip where I went to Warsaw, Kraków and Gdansk. And in the weeks building up to the trip, I was basically trying to educate myself on the country, sort of like the most important stuff that I felt like I should know. And to do that, I watched 3 films. I watched Schindler's List, I watched The Pianist, and a film called Lech Wałęsa, Man of Hope. And these are all great films. I mean, especially the first 2, right? They're just absolute classics. But I want to linger on that third one, Man of Hope, for a moment, because this one totally wasn't on my radar at all before this moment. And there's actually a personal story attached to it as well. So the night before I flew to Warsaw for this first trip to Poland, I was staying at my auntie and uncle's place because they live close to the airport. And my uncle Robert, who sadly passed away since this time, basically sat me down and said, look, if you're going to go to Poland, then you need to understand about the Solidarność movement and you need to know a bit about it. So that night we all sat down together with that in mind and we watched this film, Man of Hope. And honestly, I knew next to nothing about this. In the UK, we didn't cover any of this in school. We sort of covered the Cold War and the USSR in communism in broad brushstrokes, but never from the Polish perspective. So for me, this was just a massive education. And then fast forward a few days later, and I'm in Gdansk, actually doing a Solidarność walking tour. And I'm there by the shipyards, looking at the same scene as in the movie. And yeah, wow, what a piece of history as well. And I'd really recommend for anyone who does go to Gdansk that's curious enough to do this walking tour, because it's a great education. And that's actually a really special memory for me, because it wasn't only my first trip to Poland and to Gdansk, but it actually turned out to be one of the last times that I spent with my uncle, and it's one of my last memories with him. So even though he hasn't been able to, see my journey in Poland, really at all, he still played a really important part in it. And every time that I'm in Gdansk now, which is actually very regularly for work, and I see the shipyards and I look at those cranes, I always think of him. So yeah, as I mentioned before, I also watched The Pianist and Schindler's List, both of which are obviously incredibly heavy films. When I was in Warsaw, I actually went to one of the streets that The Pianist was filmed on in the Praga district. It's called Małe Street, which is a really special street actually, because it's still fully intact, like much of that area, which is incredibly rare for Warsaw, considering as it was completely obliterated in World War II. And then when in Kraków, I went to Auschwitz with Schindler's List still on my mind. I don't think I really need to speak too much about the Auschwitz experience. I think that's pretty well covered in general. I would just say that if you have the chance to go, it's tough, but I would recommend it. So my overall point with watching these 3 films is that they quickly helped me realize, as an outsider, the true weight and gravity of Polish history. And you begin to realize quite quickly that the history in Poland, it's all around you still. It feels very present, and it's extremely respected, of course, and acknowledged. And it's truly humbling, to learn about and to be around. And honestly, it's also just astonishing to me that cities like Warsaw, where I live, even exist at all. Not only exist, they've prospered, which I think is a true testament to the Polish spirit. So if there's any foreigners out there watching who are planning a trip to Poland or who are tempted to come to Poland, I would say you've got to understand the history, or at least try to educate yourself on it, because I'd almost say to not do so is almost negligent. Okay, so all of that covers my first trip to Poland, but now I want to fast forward a bit because it's summer 2020, and in an unexpected turn of life events, I'm now living in Poland. And so now I want to cover some of the art that I began to consume upon first arriving here, that helped me to continue getting my understanding of this country. So one of the first books that really helped to shape my understanding of Poland during this period was actually this one, which is called A Country in the Moon by an Australian writer called Michael Moran. And this is his emotional account, basically, of moving to Poland in the early to mid 90s, where he came here on a work assignment as Poland was opening up to the free market, and his job was to basically try and stimulate business of sorts. What was intended as a sort of quick work trip turned into sort of years-long love affair with the country, and him deeply exploring the people, the language, the geography. What I think I like most about this book is that it presents Poland as a country that's emotionally complicated. So that's resilient, it's proud, but it's also romantic and melancholic and just absurd also at times. And to be honest, the longer that I've spent here, the more I feel like I can relate to that. I think I also connected with this book because, it didn't start for him with, him searching for some deep emotional connection with Poland. It was just a short-term work trip which turned into something deeper. And to be honest, I can see a lot of parallels there with his story and my own. But anyway, it's a really heartfelt and well-researched book, so for any readers out there, I'd highly recommend it. Okay, so far we've covered the content which kind of acts as like an introduction to Poland that kind of covers the biggest, broadest themes of the country. But now I want to talk a little bit more about, as I started to live here longer, and some of the more niche art that I started to consume when I was living here in Warsaw. And I guess you could call it the sort of Warsaw counterculture or underground stuff that I was beginning to engage with. So when I was younger, I was very into punk rock. And in a past life, I was in a couple of bands when I lived in Newcastle and Manchester. And that was always an important part of my kind of upbringing and identity. So naturally, when I got to Warsaw, I was keen to try and, find that scene on my own as well, and what it was like here in Warsaw. And I found it. It was really cool. Particularly found a couple of really cool squats. One called Pogwash, which is unfortunately now shut down. I didn't survive the pandemic, which is very sad. And there's another one called Ada Puławska, which is in the Mokotów district as well. So this wasn't tourist Warsaw, it wasn't business Warsaw, it wasn't historical Warsaw. But yeah, it felt like something a little bit different, a little bit out of the sort of the mainstream, if you like. And I love getting to know this because every country obviously has its own version of this. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed getting to know Warsaw on these terms. I started to listen at this point to some Polish alternative and punk rock bands, if anybody knows them, although I appreciate it's pretty niche. Komety, Armia, KSU. And yeah, just started trying to, get to know the scene a little bit. Polish music in general became a really cool way for me to engage in the culture more, and particularly hip hop, actually, because it's very language driven and was a good way to try and train my ear. One hip hop artist I really like is a guy called Fish. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Partly because I just generally like the music, but he also speaks or raps really slowly. So yeah, I like to practice Polish listening to him. And then obviously, if you spend long enough in Poland, you're going to hear the likes of Taco Hemingway or Vito Bambino. I'm a fan of those guys. And actually, speaking of taco, I really like his track Deszcz na betonie, and particularly the animated video for that track. I just love it. Every time summer rolls around, I watch that a few times because it just really encapsulates something about Polish summer for me. I also started to discover older Polish music as well, so bands like Kult. I love that track, Polska, Mieszkam Polsce, and Manam as well, Kochanie, kochanie moje. Okay, enough of the sing-song. Maybe the biggest surprise for me, actually, when it came to music in Poland, or my biggest discovery, was Polish folk, or maybe it's better known as Slavic folk. There's one band in particular called the Warsaw Village Band, and they've got one track in particular called, I think it's called Dla Ciebie Kasiuniu, which I absolutely love. It's really beautiful. And I particularly like listening to this type of music when I'm on my cycling trips, out in the countryside of Poland, and I listen to that. It just feels very Slavic to me, and it completely changes the atmosphere all around me, which I absolutely love. So this covers the stuff that I generally like, but it was also the stuff that I kind of knew before as a genre, if that makes sense, with the exception of the Slavic folk example just before, where I was basically sort of taking the stuff that I liked and trying to find my Polish equivalents. But how about the stuff that was completely new to me? Polish art that introduced me to sort of completely new concepts or ideas that I hadn't encountered before. And for this, I just want to quickly jump back to film, because there are a few movies, Polish movies, that I've watched along the way that have really helped to inform my understanding of some kind of key cultural issues here in Poland. Two in particular are about the Catholic Church and religion. One's called Boże Ciało. The English title is Corpus Christi, I think. The other one's a movie called Clare, which I think the English translation of is clergy. But yeah, these are two incredibly heavy films about the Catholic Church in Poland and its sort of influence, and I guess you could say interference within society. And whether or not you agree with the message within these movies, or if you even like them at all, it's not really the point I'm making here. It's more that the very fact that these films were sort of so big in Poland, because I think they were and are very known movies, tells you something about the fact that, you know, religion in the Catholic Church is just a sort of big narrative here. It's a big talking point. It's a big cultural issue that's discussed. And I covered that on one of the previous videos that I did in terms of key cultural differences that I perceive between the UK and Poland. And yeah, this was one of the ways that I started to understand that difference is through these movies. And finally, there's one more Polish movie that I want to cover here, which is one called Day of the Wacko in English, which translates as Dzień Świra, I think, in Polish. So I watched this because it was highly recommended in general by a few Polish people that I knew, who told me like, oh, you got to watch this. It's a classic. It's so funny. And so I did. And as I was watching it, I was enjoying it, and I did enjoy it and do like it as a film, but it was also just like really heavy. And yeah, I was just not really expecting like how heavy it was, and just the sort of core themes being so based around, you know, like alienation and existential dread, and just like basically a capturing of a mental breakdown. So at first I wasn't really sure how to interpret the movie, but I think that's mostly because my expectations were a little bit out of sync with what I thought it was going to be. But actually, as I reflected on it more and then watched it again later, kind of realized it was actually quite a lot of similarities with how that movie sort of approached comedy, and how a lot of UK comedy works as well, because yeah, I think we in the UK also sort of treat comedy as a lot of self-deprecation, humiliation, can definitely get quite dark sometimes. So I actually thought there's quite a lot of overlap there in the end, once I reflected on it more. And it actually really reminded me of a movie, a cult classic in the UK called Withnail and I. So I'd highly recommend that if anybody hasn't seen it. But yeah, a lot of the same themes. So my point is that I think there is actually quite a lot of shared territory there between how Poland handles comedy and how the UK handles comedy. And I actually saw someone comment that in one of my videos the other week. And yeah, when I saw that, I was like, yeah, I actually agree. Although what I would say is that I think Poland and, you know, Day of the Wacko, Dzień Świra here particularly tends to just go like a little bit straight to the source. There's probably a little bit less nuance. And I think that's maybe quite a good like metaphor of the art for what I've come to understand Poland as in general, that, you know, communication can be more direct, and there isn't much confusion of messaging in Poland compared certainly to the UK. And so, yeah, I think that is sort of life imitating art, or art imitating life in that sense. Okay, that's it, guys. That is my little speech on how Polish art helped me to understand this country a little bit more. I hope that you enjoyed it. And yeah, the cool thing about art is that it's subjective, right? So that we can all have an opinion. So yeah, let me know what you think. If you've seen some of the things that I've talked about, some of the movies, the books, the music that I've referenced in this film, let me know. And of course, let me know if you've got any other recommendations. My quest to understand this country is ongoing and infinite, I guess you could say. So I'd love to hear your recommendations. If you like the video, then please go ahead and indeed like it. And I'd also ask you to please consider subscribing, because it helps more than you know. But until then, I will see you on the next one. Do zobaczenia I papa. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more, then you can by clicking right about here. Somewhere around there. Just here. Click it.